Hey there! Tonight we explore one of history's most remarkable military forces. The Mongol Empire, rising from the vast steppes of Central Asia, built the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. Their military machine, refined over generations and perfected under exceptional leadership, achieved what seemed impossible, conquering lands from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the borders of Egypt. Before settling in, take a moment to like this exploration if the topic interests, and perhaps share in the comments where in the world listening from. It's always wonderful to connect with fellow history enthusiasts across continents. Now get comfortable, and let's journey together through the fascinating story of Mongol military excellence. When thinking about the Mongol Empire, minds often drift toward images of endless horsemen thundering across grasslands. But the reality was far more complex and interesting. The Mongols weren't simply nomadic warriors who happened to win battles through numbers or ferocity. They were master strategists, innovative tacticians, and organisational geniuses who revolutionised warfare in ways that influenced military thinking for centuries. What made the Mongol military so extraordinarily successful wasn't any single factor, but rather a sophisticated combination of elements: superior mobility, exceptional intelligence gathering, psychological operations, adaptive tactics, innovative technology use, and perhaps most importantly, an organisational structure that maximised efficiency while maintaining flexibility. These components, working together, created a military force that repeatedly defeated much larger armies and overcame fortifications considered impregnable. The Mongols understood warfare as a science and an art. They studied their opponents carefully, adapted tactics to specific situations, and learned from every encounter. When facing enemies with superior numbers, they employed different strategies than when confronting heavily fortified cities. Against cavalry-based armies, they used tactics that differed from those employed against infantry-heavy forces. This adaptability, combined with exceptional execution, gave them advantages that transcended simple numerical strength. Tonight's exploration examines how the Mongol military system functioned, what made it so effective, and why it succeeded so consistently against diverse opponents across vast territories. This isn't about glorifying conflict, but rather understanding a historical phenomenon that shaped the medieval world and left lasting influences on military organisation and tactics. So let's begin where the Mongol story itself started, on the endless grasslands of Central Asia. The Mongol military didn't emerge from nowhere. It grew from centuries of steppe nomadic culture, where survival itself required martial skills, horsemanship, and tactical thinking. Understanding this foundation helps explain how such a formidable military force developed in relatively short time. Life on the Central Asian steppes demanded constant adaptation. The harsh environment, with its extreme temperature swings, limited water sources, and sparse vegetation, created societies where weakness meant extinction. Nomadic tribes moved seasonally, following grazing patterns for their livestock, managing complex logistics across vast distances. These movements required planning, coordination, and the ability to relocate entire communities efficiently. Every male member of steppe society learned riding from childhood. By age 3 or 4, young boys sat on horses, and by their early teens, they could ride with exceptional skill. This wasn't recreational activity, but survival necessity. Herding animals across open grasslands, hunting for food, and defending against rivals all required superb horsemanship. The steppe produced the finest horsemen in the medieval world simply because daily life demanded it. Hunting served as both sustenance and military training. Steppe nomads conducted large-scale communal hunts called nurge, where hundreds or thousands of horsemen would encircle vast areas, gradually tightening the circle while driving game inward. These hunts required coordination, communication, discipline, and tactical execution identical to military operations. Young warriors learned spacing, maintaining formations, responding to signals, and executing complex maneuvers through these hunting expeditions. Archery developed alongside riding as an essential skill. Steppe peoples hunted with bows, defended their herds with bows, and settled disputes with bows. The composite bow, perfected over centuries, represented sophisticated technology. Made from wood, sinew, and horn laminated together, these bows were compact enough to use from horseback, yet powerful enough to penetrate armour at considerable distances. Building, maintaining, and using these weapons required skills developed from childhood. The martial culture of steppe societies meant that every adult male was effectively a warrior. Unlike settled agricultural societies where most people farmed and only specialised groups fought, steppe nomads integrated military capabilities into daily life. This created enormous pools of trained, experienced mounted warriors who could be mobilised quickly without extensive additional training. Tribal organisation provided ready-made military structure. Steppe societies organised around extended families, clans and tribes, with clear hierarchies and chains of authority. These social structures transferred directly to military organisation, with family groups fighting together under familiar leaders. This social cohesion created units where trust and loyalty were already established, enhancing military effectiveness. Warfare between tribes was endemic on the steppes. Competition for grazing lands, water sources and livestock created constant low-level conflict. These intertribal wars, while smaller in scale than later Mongol conquests, provided continuous practical experience in tactics, strategy and combat. By the time the Mongols unified and turned their attention outward, they possessed generations of accumulated martial knowledge. The steppe environment itself taught valuable military lessons. The open grasslands offered nowhere to hide, making reconnaissance and information gathering crucial. The vast distances required understanding logistics, particularly water and forage management. The variable weather demanded adaptation and resilience. These environmental challenges developed skills directly applicable to military campaigns. Material simplicity characterized steppe life. Nomads couldn't accumulate many possessions because everything had to be transported regularly. This created cultures that valued mobility, flexibility and efficiency over material luxury. When these values transferred to military operations, they produced armies that moved faster, required less logistical support, and adapted more quickly than their sedentary opponents. The horse-based economy of steppe societies provided military advantages. Each family owned multiple horses, creating enormous reserves of remounts. Mongol warriors typically travelled with several horses, rotating between them to maintain speed and endurance. This practice, routine in steppe life, gave Mongol armies mobility advantages that sedentary societies couldn't match. Lactose tolerance, evolved among steppe peoples over millennia, provided practical military benefits. Warriors could sustain themselves partially on mare's milk, reducing dependence on grain supplies that slowed armies. This biological adaptation, combined with cultural practices, allowed Mongol forces to maintain campaigns with lighter logistics than opponents required. Seasonal patterns of steppe life created natural military rhythms. Summer, when horses were well fed and strong, was campaign season. Winter, harsh and demanding, was typically for rest, training and preparation. This alignment of military activities with environmental realities maximised effectiveness while minimising waste of resources. The decentralised nature of steppe societies before Mongol unification meant that many independent groups developed similar military capabilities. When Genghis Khan unified these tribes, he didn't have to create a military from scratch. Instead, he organised and directed existing martial capabilities, adding innovations and systematic approaches that transformed scattered tribal forces into a coordinated military machine. Cultural values emphasising courage, endurance and martial prowess created social environments where military excellence was highly regarded. Young men sought to prove themselves in hunting and warfare, earning status through demonstrated capability. This cultural emphasis on martial virtue ensured continuous replenishment of motivated, capable warriors. The absence of fortified cities among steppe nomads meant their military tradition emphasised mobility and manoeuvre over siege warfare. This created initial disadvantages when facing fortified settlements, but also meant their tactics weren't constrained by assumptions about static defence. When they later developed siege capabilities, they approached these challenges with fresh perspectives. Shamanic religious beliefs common among steppe peoples emphasised harmony with nature, understanding cycles and patterns, and respecting power wherever it appeared. These beliefs created cultural flexibility that later manifested in religious tolerance and willingness to adopt useful practices from conquered peoples, contributing to military adaptability. The harsh realities of steppe life created peoples who were physically hardy, accustomed to discomfort, and mentally resilient. Soldiers from these backgrounds could endure hardships that broke soldiers from more comfortable societies. This natural toughness, developed through lifelong exposure to challenging conditions, provided significant military advantages. Women in steppe societies often learned riding and archery, and some accompanied men on military campaigns, managing logistics and camps. This fuller utilization of human resources contributed to military effectiveness, as it freed male warriors for combat roles while ensuring efficient support operations. By the time Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, began unifying Mongol tribes in the late 12th century, all these elements existed. The raw materials for an exceptional military force were present. What remained was organization, leadership and strategic vision to transform scattered tribal capabilities into the disciplined, innovative military machine that would soon astonish the world. Before becoming a world-conquering force, the Mongol military needed to be created as a coherent organization. This transformation, primarily the work of Genghis Khan, represented perhaps the most crucial factor in Mongol military success. The organizational innovations implemented during unification provided the foundation for everything that followed. Genghis Khan, born Temujin around 1162, spent his early life navigating the violent tribal politics of the Mongol steppes. His experiences, including periods of poverty, enslavement and constant threat, taught lessons about loyalty, organization, and the weaknesses of traditional tribal structures. When he finally achieved dominance and took the title Genghis Khan in 1206, he possessed both the authority and the knowledge to implement revolutionary changes. The decimal organization system formed the backbone of Mongol military structure. Armies were divided into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, called arbans, zuns, mingans, and tumans respectively. This simple, scalable system provided clear chains of command and made coordination of large forces manageable. A commander knew exactly how many units he controlled, and orders could flow efficiently through the hierarchy. This decimal system broke traditional tribal affiliations. Warriors were assigned to units without regard to their original tribe or clan. An arban of 10 warriors might include men from several different tribes, united under a common commander. This deliberate policy prevented old tribal loyalties from undermining military cohesion, and created new identities based on military units rather than kinship groups. Promotion based on merit rather than birth represented a radical departure from tribal tradition. Genghis Khan appointed commanders based on demonstrated capability, regardless of their social origin. Some of his most successful generals came from humble backgrounds, elevated through proven excellence in strategy, tactics, and leadership. This meritocracy ensured that capable leaders held positions of authority, while creating incentives for all warriors to excel. The establishment of the kishig, an elite guard unit, served multiple purposes. This force, comprising the best warriors selected from across the empire, served as both personal protection for the Khan and as a training ground for future commanders. Members of the kishig received instruction in strategy, tactics, administration, and leadership. Many later became generals, governors, and high officials, spreading standardized practices throughout the military and government. Strict discipline became a hallmark of Mongol military organization. Punishments for cowardice, disobedience, or desertion were severe, often extending to the entire unit. If one warrior fled in battle, his entire arban faced consequences. This collective responsibility ensured that warriors looked out for one another and maintained unit cohesion even under difficult circumstances. The system created strong peer pressure to maintain standards. Training standardization meant that warriors across the empire learned identical tactics, signals, and formations. This universal training allowed units from different parts of the empire to work together seamlessly. A Minghan from Mongolia could coordinate with a Minghan from Persia because they used the same systems and understood the same commands. This standardization was revolutionary for its time. The creation of specialized units addressed specific tactical needs. While most Mongol warriors were light cavalry archers, specialized heavy cavalry units provided shock capability. Engineering units, initially composed of Chinese specialists, managed siege equipment and fortification operations. These specialized forces integrated into the overall army structure, providing capabilities beyond those of standard cavalry units. Communication systems received particular attention. The Mongol military developed sophisticated signal systems using flags, smoke, and sound. Different coloured flags indicated different commands visible across battlefields. Drums and horns transmitted orders audible over combat noise. These systems allowed commanders to coordinate movements and respond to changing conditions without messengers riding between units. The YAM system, a network of way stations across Mongol territories, supported both military operations and imperial administration. Stations spaced roughly a day's ride apart provided fresh horses, supplies, and rest for messengers and military units. This infrastructure enabled rapid communication and movement across vast distances, with urgent messages travelling up to 200 miles per day through relay systems. Intelligence gathering became formalised and systematic. The Mongols established networks of spies, merchants, and informants throughout targeted regions. Before launching campaigns, they collected detailed information about enemy strength, leadership, fortifications, political divisions, and economic resources. This intelligence gathering often continued for months or years before military action commenced. Psychological operations received as much attention as physical preparation. The Mongols deliberately cultivated fearsome reputations, sometimes exaggerating their numbers and ferocity. They employed terror strategically, knowing that enemies who surrendered quickly avoided devastation, while those who resisted faced harsh treatment. This reputation often achieved objectives without battle, as enemies chose submission over resistance. The organisation of logistics supported extended campaigns far from Mongol homelands. Each warrior carried tools for basic maintenance, spare bowstrings, and portable rations. Herds of livestock accompanied armies, providing meat and milk. This self-sufficient approach, combined with living off conquered territories when possible, allowed Mongol forces to maintain operations in distant lands without supply lines vulnerable to interruption. Legal codification under the Yasa, Genghis Khan's law code, extended to military matters. Clear regulations governed conduct, division of spoils, treatment of prisoners, and many other aspects of military life. This legal framework provided predictability and fairness, at least by standards of the time, which contributed to military effectiveness by reducing internal conflicts and establishing clear expectations. The integration of conquered peoples into the military organisation multiplied Mongol strength. Rather than simply extracting tribute, the Mongols incorporated capable warriors from defeated peoples into their armies. Chinese engineers, Persian administrators, Turkish cavalrymen, and many others brought specialised skills that enhanced overall military capability. This practice transformed conquered populations from liabilities into assets. Religious tolerance within the military avoided many internal conflicts. Mongol armies included Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and practitioners of various shamanistic traditions. This diversity, unusual for the period, was managed through tolerance policies that demanded loyalty to the empire, but allowed personal religious practices. The pragmatic approach prevented religious tensions from undermining military cohesion. The establishment of regular training cycles maintained military readiness. Even during peace, units conducted exercises, hunts, and reviews that kept skills sharp. The transition from peace to war required minimal preparation because warriors remained in constant practice. This standing readiness gave the Mongols significant advantages in campaign initiation. Record-keeping, borrowed from Chinese administrative practices, allowed the Mongol military to maintain detailed information about units, equipment, supplies, and personnel. These records, unusual among nomadic peoples, enabled long-term planning and efficient resource management. Commanders could access information about available forces, their composition, and their readiness. The integration of siege warfare capabilities, initially a weakness, showed the Mongol military's adaptability. After early difficulties with fortified cities, they actively recruited experts in siege engineering, studied enemy techniques, and developed their own approaches to fortress warfare. This willingness to identify weaknesses and address them systematically characterized Mongol military development. Command independence, balanced with overall coordination, gave Mongol armies flexibility. While strategic objectives came from central authority, field commanders possessed significant discretion in tactical execution. This balance allowed adaptation to local conditions while maintaining strategic coherence. Capable commanders could seize opportunities without waiting for distant approval. The organisation of campaign planning involved careful preparation before armies moved. Objectives were identified, routes planned, intelligence gathered, and resources assembled before campaigns commenced. This methodical approach contrasted with more impulsive military traditions and contributed significantly to Mongol success rates. Succession planning ensured continuity, even as individual leaders changed. The system created by Genghis Khan survived his death, with successors continuing and expanding his military innovations. This institutional durability, unusual for empires built by charismatic founders, reflected the strength of the organisational foundations established during the early period. At the heart of Mongol military supremacy lay mastery of mounted archery, a skill that required years to develop and offered devastating effectiveness in battle. Understanding how Mongol warriors used this technique illuminates much about their tactical superiority. The composite bow used by Mongol warriors represented centuries of refinement. Constructed from wood, horn, and sinew laminated together, these bows combined power with compact size. When unstrung, they curved backward in what's called a reflex shape, storing enormous energy. Once strung and drawn, they could propel arrows with sufficient force to penetrate armour at considerable distances, with effective ranges exceeding 300 yards and maximum ranges approaching 600 yards. Creating these bows required specialised knowledge and considerable time. The materials needed careful selection and preparation. Wood formed the core, with different types preferred in different regions. Horn, typically from water buffalo, formed the belly of the bow, facing the archer. Sinew, carefully processed and applied in layers, formed the back. The lamination process involved careful application of glue and months of drying and curing. A master bowyer might spend a year creating a single high-quality bow. The arrows themselves varied depending on the intended use. Light arrows for long-range shooting, heavier arrows for penetrating armour, arrows with different head shapes for specific purposes. Mongol warriors carried multiple arrow types, selecting appropriate ones for circumstances. Quivers held 30 or more arrows, and experienced archers could shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute, filling the air with projectiles that created zones of death opposing forces struggled to penetrate. Learning mounted archery began in childhood and continued throughout a warrior's life. The skill required coordinating horsemanship with archery, maintaining accuracy while moving, timing shots to coincide with a horse's gait, and managing equipment while controlling the mount. Young boys practiced shooting from stationary horses before progressing to shooting while moving, and eventually mastering the art of accurate shooting at various gaits and from various angles. The famous Parthian shot, shooting backward while retreating, exemplified advanced mounted archery technique. This manoeuvre, inherited from earlier steppe peoples, allowed Mongol cavalry to maintain offensive capability while withdrawing. Armies pursuing what appeared to be fleeing Mongols suddenly faced volleys of arrows from riders who twisted in their saddles to shoot backward. This technique, requiring exceptional balance and timing, devastated many opponents who mistook tactical retreats for actual flight. The Mongol saddle, designed for stability and endurance, facilitated mounted archery. High cantles and pommels provided support, allowing riders to stand in stirrups for better shooting positions. Stirrups themselves, which had diffused into steppe cultures centuries earlier, gave archers stable platforms from which to shoot. The entire equipment system worked together to maximise the rider's effectiveness. Training exercises developed coordination between rider and mount. Warriors practiced shooting at targets while riding at various speeds, from walks to full gallops. They shot at ground targets and elevated targets, practicing various angles and distances. Group exercises developed timing, with formations releasing volleys simultaneously to maximise impact. These training regimens created muscle memory that allowed warriors to perform complex actions automatically during combat stress. The psychological impact of mounted archery shouldn't be underestimated. Opposing forces faced enemies who attacked from distances where they themselves couldn't respond effectively, maintaining mobility that made them difficult targets while delivering continuous fire. The sound of thousands of arrows in flight created terrifying experiences for those receiving fire. Maintaining formation and morale under such conditions challenged even veteran troops. Tactical applications of mounted archery varied based on opponents and terrain. Against infantry formations, Mongol cavalry would circle at distances beyond effective enemy retaliation, pouring arrows into formations until they broke. Against cavalry, they used mobility to maintain favourable engagement ranges, retreating when enemies advanced, advancing when enemies retreated, all while maintaining steady arrow fire. This combination of firepower and mobility proved devastatingly effective. The economic efficiency of arrow warfare deserves recognition. Arrows could be recovered after battles and reused if undamaged. Production of arrows, while requiring skill, was less resource-intensive than maintaining heavy cavalry with extensive armour and lances. This economic advantage allowed the Mongols to sustain longer campaigns with less logistical burden than opponents relying on different military traditions. Integration of mounted archery with other tactical elements maximised effectiveness. Light cavalry archers softened enemy formations, which heavy cavalry could then charge against weakened opposition, or archers would harass enemies while siege equipment prepared assaults on fortifications. The flexibility to combine mounted archery with other capabilities gave Mongol commanders numerous tactical options. Environmental adaptation showed in how mounted archery was employed in different terrains. On open steppes, the technique reached its full potential with unrestricted movement and clear lines of sight. In forested or mountainous regions, tactics adjusted to terrain constraints, with archers operating more cautiously and using terrain features for protection. This adaptability ensured the technique remained effective across diverse landscapes. The supply of arrows represented significant logistical considerations. Armies on campaign needed enormous quantities, potentially thousands of arrows per warrior over extended periods. The Mongols addressed this through multiple approaches, carrying large initial supplies, manufacturing arrows during campaigns using local materials, capturing enemy supplies, and recovering arrows after engagements. This multifaceted approach maintained arrow availability. Communication while executing mounted archery maneuvers relied on the sophisticated signal systems developed by Mongol military organization. Flags and horn signals coordinated formations, indicated targets, and commanded changes in tactics. Warriors trained to respond instantly to these signals while maintaining individual archery. Effectiveness demonstrated the high level of coordination achieved through training and organization. The maintenance skills required for mounted archery warfare created constant low-level activity. Bows required regular care to maintain proper function, with moisture and temperature changes affecting performance. Bowstrings needed regular replacement. Arrows required inspection and repair. Mongol warriors spent time during camps maintaining equipment, ensuring readiness for the next engagement. This maintenance culture prevented equipment failures at critical moments. Competition and status based on archery skill created internal incentives for excellence. Warriors who demonstrated superior shooting earned recognition and advancement opportunities. Periodic competitions during peaceful periods maintained skills while providing entertainment and establishing hierarchies based on demonstrated capability. This integration of martial skills into social status ensured continuous motivation for improvement. The integration of hunting with military training meant that mounted archery skills remained sharp, even during peaceful periods. Large-scale hunts, conducted like military operations, provided practice opportunities while producing food. This dual purpose ensured that skills essential for warfare were regularly exercised regardless of whether actual military campaigns were underway. The Mongol military's success depended not just on battlefield excellence, but on thorough preparation and intelligence gathering that preceded military action. This systematic approach to strategic planning gave them decisive advantages before combat even began. Intelligence networks established far in advance of military campaigns provided detailed information about target territories. Mongol agents, often merchants or travellers who aroused no suspicion, spent months or years in regions of interest. These operatives gathered information about military strengths, fortification locations, political divisions, economic conditions, and geographic features. By the time Mongol armies approached, commanders possessed comprehensive understanding of what they would face. The debriefing of travellers and merchants provided continuous information updates. Anyone who had visited regions of interest might be questioned extensively. Routes, water sources, population centres, defensive preparations, political conditions, all these details were collected systematically. This information aggregation created detailed intelligence pictures without requiring dedicated spy networks in many cases. Diplomatic missions, often preceding military action by years, served intelligence functions alongside their overt purposes. Ambassadors and envoys observed military preparations, assessed leadership capabilities, identified political factions, and evaluated resolve. When negotiations failed or weren't seriously intended in the first place, the Mongols possessed insider knowledge that informed subsequent military planning. The exploitation of political divisions within target territories represented a key strategic principle. Mongol intelligence gathering specifically identified internal conflicts, dissatisfied factions, and potential collaborators. Military campaigns often coordinated with rebellions, or included offers of favourable treatment to those who cooperated. This political warfare sometimes achieved objectives without extended military campaigns. Geographic reconnaissance received particular attention. Routes between regions, mountain passes, river crossings, forest boundaries, desert edges, all geographic features that would affect military movements were identified and catalogued. This knowledge allowed Mongol armies to appear in unexpected locations, having identified routes that defenders considered impassable. The gathering of information about specific enemies, their tactics, equipment and traditions allowed development of tailored strategies. Before facing European knights, the Mongols had already fought heavily armoured cavalry from the Khwarezmian Empire, learning how to counter such forces. When they later encountered Hungarian and Polish knights, they applied refined tactics specifically designed to defeat heavy cavalry formations. Economic intelligence identified where resources could be obtained to sustain campaigns. Regions with surplus grain, areas with extensive livestock, water sources sufficient for large forces, timber for siege equipment, all these factors entered into campaign planning. Armies moved through routes that provided sustenance rather than requiring long supply lines from distant bases. The timing of campaigns reflected careful strategic calculation. Attacks often came when enemies faced internal difficulties, after poor harvests weakened resistance, or during seasons when defending armies were dispersed. This timing advantage, based on good intelligence, increased success probabilities before battles began. Psychological preparation of targeted regions sometimes preceded military action by years. Stories of Mongol power, accounts of previous victories, descriptions of what awaited those who resisted versus those who surrendered, all spread through merchants, travellers and refugees. By the time armies appeared, many populations were already psychologically prepared for submission. The coordination of multiple columns over vast distances demonstrated sophisticated planning capabilities. Mongol campaigns sometimes involved armies operating hundreds of miles apart, converging on objectives in synchronized timing that required precise coordination. These complex operations, comparable to modern multi-front campaigns, required detailed planning and reliable communication systems. Map-making and geographic knowledge, borrowed and enhanced from various civilizations, supported strategic planning. The Mongols collected maps, consulted with geographers, and maintained their own records of routes and territories. This geographic literacy, unusual among nomadic peoples, enabled strategic thinking across continental scales. The identification of strategic objectives rather than tactical targets showed mature military thinking. Campaigns aimed at eliminating rival powers, controlling trade routes, or securing resources proceeded according to plans that might take years to complete. This long-term strategic perspective contrasted with many medieval military traditions focused on immediate tactical objectives. The adaptation of strategies to different opponents showed sophistication. The approaches used against settled agricultural societies differed from those employed against nomadic rivals. The campaigns in China involved different considerations than those in Persia or Russia. This flexibility in strategic thinking prevented rigid adherence to single approaches regardless of circumstances. Risk assessment and mitigation planning showed that Mongol strategists thought beyond simple victory scenarios. Campaigns included provisions for contingencies, fallback positions, alternative routes, and responses to unexpected developments. This planning depth increased the likelihood that campaigns could adapt to surprises without collapsing. The use of deception and misinformation as strategic tools demonstrated psychological sophistication. False intelligence fed to enemies, exaggerated force strengths, misleading movements, all served to confuse and misdirect opponents. Mongol armies sometimes appeared in unexpected locations because strategic deceptions convinced enemies to prepare in wrong areas. Learning from failures and setbacks showed that the Mongol strategic approach included adaptation based on experience. When initial approaches to fortified cities proved inadequate, they studied siege warfare and incorporated new techniques. When certain tactics proved ineffective against specific enemies, they developed alternatives. This organizational learning prevented repeated mistakes. The strategic use of terror, while harsh by modern standards, reflected calculated thinking about achieving objectives efficiently. The Mongols recognized that establishing reputations for unstoppable victory and harsh treatment of resistance sometimes convinced enemies to surrender without fighting, saving both time and resources. This cost-benefit analysis of terror as a tool characterized their pragmatic approach. The integration of strategic planning with logistics ensured that armies could actually execute planned campaigns. Routes were selected that provided forage for horses and food for warriors. Campaign seasons matched when horses were strongest. Water sources along routes were identified. This integration of planning with practical sustainment requirements prevented strategies from failing due to logistical shortfalls. The preservation of institutional knowledge meant that strategic lessons learned during one campaign informed planning for subsequent operations. The Mongols maintained oral traditions and, increasingly, written records that captured experience. Commanders studied previous campaigns, learning both from successes and failures, building an evolving body of strategic knowledge. On the battlefield itself, Mongol military forces demonstrated remarkable tactical flexibility, adapting to circumstances with speed and precision that repeatedly caught opponents unprepared. This tactical sophistication translated strategic advantages into concrete victories. The feigned retreat, perhaps the most famous Mongol tactic, exemplified their tactical sophistication. Units would engage enemies, then appear to flee in disorder. Pursuing forces, believing they had achieved victory, would break formation and scatter in pursuit. Once enemy formations collapsed, the fleeing Mongols would suddenly wheel and counterattack, now facing dispersed, disorganized opponents. This tactic, simple in concept, required disciplined execution and worked repeatedly because it exploited natural human impulses. The use of terrain showed tactical intelligence. Mongol forces positioned themselves to maximize advantages and minimize disadvantages. They avoided terrain that limited mobility, while forcing enemies onto ground that favored Mongol tactics. Rivers, hills, forests, wetlands, all geographic features were analyzed for tactical implications and exploited skillfully. The practice of attacking from multiple directions simultaneously prevented enemies from concentrating forces effectively. While one force engaged from the front, others struck flanks and rear. This multi-directional pressure made coherent defense extremely difficult, and forced opponents to divide attention and resources. The coordination required for such attacks reflected the training and communication systems that unified Mongol forces. Targeting of enemy leadership represented deliberate tactical priority. Arrows focused on identifiable commanders, attempting to disrupt enemy command and control. Once leadership fell or was isolated, enemy formations lost coordination, making them vulnerable to exploitation. This targeting doctrine recognized that defeating enemy leadership often preceded defeating enemy armies. The manipulation of combat tempo showed tactical sophistication. Mongol forces would accelerate and decelerate engagements deliberately, advancing when advantageous, withdrawing when enemy responses threatened disadvantage. This tempo control, based on reading battlefield conditions and enemy behavior, prevented opponents from dictating battle rhythms. The use of massed archery fire created zones of danger that channeled enemy movements. By concentrating arrow fire in specific areas, Mongol forces effectively denied certain terrain to enemies, forcing them into positions where they faced additional disadvantages. This use of firepower to shape enemy behavior represented sophisticated tactical thinking. The integration of light and heavy cavalry in coordinated attacks combined the best attributes of each force type. Light cavalry would harass and disorder enemy formations, after which heavy cavalry would charge, delivering shock impact against weakened opposition. This combination compensated for the Mongols' initial relative weakness in heavy cavalry by ensuring it was employed against already disrupted enemies. Ambush tactics showed that despite their association with open plains warfare, the Mongols understood concealment and surprise. Units would hide in terrain features, wait for enemies to move into disadvantageous positions, then strike suddenly. These ambushes, particularly effective in forested or mountainous terrain, demonstrated adaptability beyond simple cavalry charges. The tactical use of weather conditions gave Mongols additional advantages. They timed attacks for moments when sun, wind, or weather favoured their forces and disadvantaged enemies. Attacking with sun in enemy eyes, using wind to carry dust into enemy formations, launching assaults during rain that disrupted enemy archery, all showed attention to environmental factors. The practice of maintaining reserves, forces held back from initial engagements, allowed Mongol commanders to respond to battlefield developments. When enemies exposed weaknesses, fresh forces could exploit them. When Mongol units faced difficulties, reserves could reinforce them. This reserve principle provided flexibility that made tactical plans robust against unexpected developments. Communication during battles, through flags, horns, and messengers, allowed commanders to adjust tactics in real time. Unlike many medieval battles where initial dispositions largely determined outcomes, Mongol engagements involved continuous tactical adjustments as commanders responded to evolving situations. This dynamic command and control provided significant advantages. The practice of pursuit after victories maximised their impact. Rather than simply winning battles and stopping, Mongol forces pursued defeated enemies relentlessly, preventing them from regrouping and ensuring that tactical victories translated into strategic gains. This pursuit doctrine meant that defeats inflicted on enemies were thorough and lasting. Defensive tactics, while less celebrated than offensive operations, showed equal sophistication. When defending territory or positions, Mongols established layered defences, used mobility to counter enemy concentrations, and employed scorched earth tactics, earth policies to deny resources to invaders. These defensive capabilities prevented enemies from easily reversing Mongol gains. The integration of siege warfare with field tactics allowed coordinated operations around fortified positions. While siege equipment worked to breach fortifications, cavalry forces prevented relief attempts and cut supply lines. This integration of siege and maneuver warfare created situations where fortified cities fell despite strong defences. The tactical use of prisoners and auxiliary forces showed strategic pragmatism. Captured troops sometimes found themselves driven ahead of Mongol forces, absorbing initial defensive fire and filling moats. While harsh, this practice reflected the Mongols' ruthless efficiency in using all available resources to achieve objectives. Night operations, relatively unusual in medieval warfare, featured in Mongol tactics. They launched attacks under darkness when opponents expected respite, used darkness to approach positions undetected, and employed light discipline to prevent enemies from gauging their positions and strength. This willingness to fight at night provided additional tactical flexibility. The speed of tactical execution, enabled by superior mobility and discipline, gave Mongols initiative advantages. They could implement tactical plans faster than opponents could respond, creating cascading advantages as enemies struggled to react to already changed situations. This speed advantage made Mongol tactics more decisive than slower-moving opponents could match. Initially, the Mongol military faced challenges when confronting heavily fortified cities and castles. Their nomadic background didn't prepare them for siege warfare, which required different technologies, tactics, and patience than cavalry operations in open terrain. However, the Mongol response to this weakness demonstrated their military system's adaptability and learning capacity. Early encounters with fortified Chinese cities exposed Mongol limitations in siege warfare. Cities with strong walls, adequate supplies, and determined defenders could resist for extended periods, frustrating Mongol campaigns. Initial attempts to simply starve out fortifications proved time-consuming and tied down forces needed elsewhere. Recognition of this weakness prompted systematic efforts to develop siege capabilities. The recruitment of Chinese engineers and siege specialists began the transformation. These experts brought knowledge of sophisticated siege technologies developed over centuries of Chinese warfare. Catapults, trebuchets, siege towers, battering rams, and undermining techniques all entered the Mongol military repertoire through this technology transfer. The trebuchet, a counterweight-powered stone-throwing engine, became a particularly important addition to Mongol siege warfare. These machines, capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds across considerable distances, could batter walls and destroy buildings within cities. Construction and operation of trebuchets required engineering knowledge that Chinese specialists provided and Mongols quickly absorbed. Gunpowder weapons, encountered during campaigns in China, gradually integrated into Mongol siege operations. Early gunpowder devices, primarily incendiary and explosive projectiles, added to the arsenal of siege weapons. While not yet the dominant force they would later become, these weapons provided additional options for attacking fortifications. The organisation of specialised siege units paralleled battlefield unit structures. Engineers, artillerymen, and sappers formed dedicated units that could be assigned to siege operations. These specialists trained specifically in their roles, developing expertise that made Mongol siege warfare increasingly effective over time. The tactics of psychological pressure enhanced physical siege methods. Mongols sometimes built siege equipment within sight of defenders, demonstrating capability while allowing time for surrender negotiations. The visible presence of massive siege engines, combined with knowledge of what awaited if cities fell by assault, convinced many garrisons to surrender rather than face prolonged sieges. Cutting supply lines and isolating fortified positions formed standard siege procedures. Cavalry forces excelled at surrounding cities, preventing relief columns from breaking sieges and intercepting supply caravans. This combination of military blockade with direct assault preparations created situations where defenders faced both immediate physical threats and long-term resource depletion. The use of captured populations and prisoners in siege operations, while harsh, reflected Mongol pragmatism. Prisoners sometimes filled moats with bundles of material or absorbed initial defensive fire. This practice, though brutal by modern standards, demonstrated the lengths to which Mongol forces would go to overcome fortifications efficiently. The study of local siege warfare traditions added to Mongol capabilities. In each region conquered, they observed and absorbed effective techniques used by local forces. Persian siege methods, European approaches, Chinese innovations all contributed to an ever-expanding repertoire of siege warfare knowledge. This synthesis of diverse traditions created siege capabilities drawing on multiple civilizations' accumulated wisdom. The combination of patience with aggression characterized mature Mongol siege warfare. Forces would invest cities for extended periods if necessary, maintaining blockades while simultaneously preparing and conducting assaults. This dual approach meant defenders faced both immediate pressure and the certainty that time wasn't on their side. Undermining fortifications, digging tunnels beneath walls to cause collapses, became a standard Mongol siege technique. Specialized sappers, often recruited from regions with mining traditions, dug extensive tunnel networks. Timbers supporting tunnels would be burned, causing collapses that breached walls or created ramps for assault forces. The use of river diversions and flooding demonstrated large-scale engineering in service of siege warfare. In several notable sieges, Mongol forces diverted rivers away from cities to eliminate water supplies or channeled water to flood lower-lying defensive positions. These massive engineering projects showed the scale of resources the Mongols could apply to overcoming fortifications. Escalade tactics, direct assault using scaling ladders, featured in many sieges. While often resulting in high casualties, these attacks sometimes succeeded through determination and coordination. Multiple simultaneous escalade attempts at different wall points divided defender attention and increased breakthrough probabilities. The timing of final assaults reflected strategic calculation. Attacks often came after siege equipment had damaged defences, after supplies ran low, after disease weakened garrisons, or after morale broke. This timing maximised success probability while minimising attacker casualties, showing that Mongol commanders valued their troops' lives within the context of military effectiveness. The treatment of captured cities varied based on resistance level. Cities that surrendered quickly often received relatively lenient treatment, with populations spared and governance structures maintained. Cities that resisted and fell only after costly sieges faced much harsher consequences. This deliberate policy, while severe, created incentives for others to surrender rather than resist. The integration of siege warfare with broader campaign strategies showed sophistication. Sieges were conducted as part of larger operational plans, not as isolated events. Forces besieging one city remained part of coordinated campaigns involving multiple objectives. This integration prevented sieges from becoming dead ends that absorbed resources without contributing to strategic objectives. The evolution from siege warfare weakness to competence and eventually sophistication occurred within decades. This rapid development showcased the Mongol military system's capacity for institutional learning and adaptation. By the mid-13th century, the Mongols were as capable at siege warfare as any force in the medieval world, having started the century with minimal siege capabilities. Behind every successful military campaign lay complex logistics that sustained forces far from home territories. The Mongol military's logistical capabilities, often overlooked in favour of more dramatic tactical discussions, were essential to their sustained successes across vast distances. The horse-based mobility of Mongol forces provided both advantages and challenges logistically. Each warrior required multiple horses, typically 3 to 5, allowing rapid movement and providing remounts when horses tired. However, this meant that an army of 10,000 warriors required 30,000 to 50,000 horses, creating enormous grazing and watering requirements. The practice of living off the land reduced dependence on supply trains that slowed many medieval armies. Mongol warriors could sustain themselves on mare's milk, supplemented by hunting and gathering when available. This capability to extract sustenance from environments they passed through gave them logistical flexibility that opponents couldn't match. The seasonal timing of campaigns reflected understanding of logistical realities. Spring and summer campaigns occurred when horses were well fed and strong after winter grazing. Fall campaigning was possible, but armies typically returned to winter pastures before the harshest weather. This alignment with seasonal cycles optimized animal condition, which directly affected military capability. The establishment of supply depots along major campaign routes provided support for extended operations. These depots, positioned strategically, held grain, arrows, equipment, and other supplies that armies could draw upon. The network of depots created along major routes enabled campaigns extending thousands of miles from Mongol homelands. The use of local resources in conquered territories sustained long-term occupations. Rather than shipping everything from Mongolia, armies increasingly requisitioned supplies from areas they controlled. This practice turned conquered territories into logistical assets rather than drains on homeland resources. The portability of Mongol equipment contributed to logistical efficiency. Warriors carried relatively light personal equipment compared to heavily armoured European knights. The composite bow, while powerful, was compact. Armour, when worn, tended to be lamella or scale rather than heavy plate. This lighter equipment reduced the weight horses needed to carry, supporting sustained mobility. The management of captured livestock provided both sustenance and additional transportation capability. Cattle, sheep, and camels captured during campaigns supplemented army food supplies and could carry additional equipment. This practice of incorporating captured resources into military logistics expanded capability without requiring equivalent increases in supply from homelands. The manufacture of arrows during campaigns addressed one of the most significant logistical challenges. Skilled craftspeople travelled with armies, producing arrows using local materials. Willow and other readily available woods formed shafts, local iron provided arrowheads, and feathers from local birds fletched the arrows. This mobile production capability maintained arrow supplies without requiring massive transport from distant arsenals. The recovery and reuse of arrows after engagements contributed to logistical sustainability. After battles, forces collected arrows from battlefields, including enemy arrows. Undamaged arrows returned to quivers, while damaged arrows were repaired or recycled. This recovery practice reduced the total arrow production requirement. The repair and maintenance of equipment during campaigns prevented cumulative degradation. Skilled craftspeople, including bowyers, leatherworkers, and blacksmiths, accompanied armies and maintained equipment. This organic maintenance capability kept forces operational during extended campaigns far from homeland workshops. Water management represented a critical logistical concern, particularly for large forces with enormous horse herds. Mongol armies planned routes with careful attention to water availability. Scouts identified water sources ahead of main forces, and advanced units sometimes improved water access by digging wells or clearing springs before main forces arrived. The use of camels in certain regions provided additional logistical capability. In desert and arid regions, camels carried supplies and equipment, complementing horses. These pack animals, obtained locally or brought from homeland herds, enhanced the military's ability to operate in water-scarce environments. The establishment of garrison forces in conquered territories reduced field army size requirements. Rather than holding all territory with mobile armies, the Mongols garrisoned strategic points with permanent forces. These garrisons, often including local recruits, maintained control while allowing field armies to remain relatively modest in size and highly mobile. The tribute system that developed in conquered territories provided economic support for military operations. Regular tribute payments in grain, livestock, manufactured goods, and money-funded campaigns and supported forces without entirely depleting Mongol homeland resources. This systematic extraction of resources from controlled territories sustained the empire's military activities. The organisation of logistics followed the same decimal system used in combat units. Specific warriors within each unit had designated logistics responsibilities, managing horses, maintaining equipment or organising supplies. This decentralisation of logistics functions prevented single points of failure and ensured that units could function semi-independently if necessary. The speed of Mongol movements, while tactically advantageous, created logistical challenges that were met through careful planning. Forces moving rapidly couldn't rely on slow-moving supply trains. Instead, they carried what they needed, lived off the land, and maintained light logistics footprints that enabled the speed that gave them tactical advantages. Communication systems that supported military operations also served logistical functions. The YAM relay stations provided not just message transmission, but also served as supply points, rest stations and coordination centres for logistics operations. This integration of communication and logistics infrastructure supported both military effectiveness and administrative efficiency. The integration of conquered peoples' expertise enhanced logistical capabilities. Chinese agricultural knowledge improved food production in occupied territories. Persian administrative skills organised more efficient tribute collection. Turkish and Central Asian peoples contributed experience in managing mobile logistics across varied terrain. This synthesis of diverse knowledge built increasingly sophisticated logistical systems. The effectiveness of the Mongol military depended fundamentally on capable leadership at all levels, from supreme commanders to 10-man unit leaders. The command structure, carefully designed and continuously refined, ensured coordinated action across forces numbering in the tens of thousands. Supreme command rested with the Great Khan, but actual military operations were delegated to trusted generals called Noyan. These commanders, selected for proven capability rather than birth, led major campaigns with considerable autonomy. The Khan established strategic objectives, but execution was left to field commanders who understood local conditions and could adapt to circumstances. The Mongol command philosophy emphasized decentralized execution within centralized strategic frameworks. Commanders received objectives and resources, but possessed latitude in how they accomplished missions. This approach allowed rapid decision-making without requiring communication with distant supreme authorities for every tactical decision. The training ground of the Kashig, the Khan's personal guard, produced many future commanders. Service in this elite unit provided exposure to strategic thinking, administrative processes, and leadership examples. Members learned not just military skills, but also how to command, organize, and inspire forces. Graduates of the Keshig carried standardized leadership approaches throughout the military. Communication between command levels utilized the sophisticated messaging systems developed empire-wide. Important decisions, strategic changes, or intelligence reports moved rapidly through the YAM station network. This rapid communication allowed coordination across vast distances while maintaining operational tempo. The practice of council meetings before major operations brought together senior commanders to discuss plans. These councils, called Kuriltai at the highest level, allowed exchange of ideas, identification of potential problems, and refinement of plans. While ultimate decisions rested with supreme commanders, the consultative process incorporated diverse perspectives and expertise. Unit cohesion under immediate commanders created strong fighting forces. Warriors knew their Arban, Zun, and Mingan commanders personally, and fought under them repeatedly. This familiarity bred trust and understanding, with soldiers confident in their leaders' abilities, and leaders familiar with their warriors' capabilities and limitations. The punishment of commanders who failed through incompetence or cowardice maintained leadership quality. Mongol military culture held leaders accountable for unit performance. Success brought rewards and advancement. Failure brought consequences. This accountability system ensured that commanders at all levels understood their responsibilities and the stakes involved in their decisions. The promotion system's meritocratic principles meant that capable subordinates could rise rapidly. A warrior demonstrating exceptional skill and leadership ability might progress from Arban leader to Zun commander to Minghan commander within a few campaigns. This social mobility ensured that talented individuals weren't trapped in low-level positions by birth circumstances. The integration of conquered peoples into command structures, while initially limited, gradually expanded. Capable leaders from defeated nations who demonstrated loyalty and ability sometimes received command positions, particularly in technical areas like siege warfare or naval operations, where they brought specialized expertise the Mongols initially lacked. Leadership styles varied, but certain characteristics were emphasized. Courage, demonstrated by personal participation in combat. Competence, shown through successful execution of operations. Care for subordinates, ensuring warriors received supplies, treatment, and rewards. Commanders embodying these qualities earned loyalty and effectiveness that enhanced military capabilities. The use of subordinate commanders as semi-independent task force leaders allowed complex multi-front operations. A senior general might divide forces, sending Minghan commanders on separate missions while maintaining overall strategic coordination. This practice required great trust in subordinate capabilities, but multiplied the military's effective reach. The rotation of commanders between different regions prevented localization that might undermine central authority. Generals who succeeded in China might be transferred to Persia. Successful Persian commanders might campaign in Eastern Europe. This rotation prevented commanders from developing independent power bases while spreading expertise across the empire. The emphasis on intelligence and information flow to commanders ensured good decision-making. Leaders received regular reports about enemy dispositions, terrain conditions, supply status, and strategic developments. This information flow, facilitated by dedicated communication systems, allowed commanders to make decisions based on current, comprehensive understanding. The practice of holding commanders responsible not just for victories but for losses incurred, achieving them encouraged efficiency. A commander who achieved objectives but with unnecessary casualties faced criticism and potential consequences. This accountability encouraged tactical sophistication and care in planning, rather than simply throwing forces at problems. The inspiration provided by exceptional commanders like Subutai, Jebe and others created models of leadership excellence. These generals' campaigns were studied, their tactics emulated, and their successes celebrated. The institutional memory of exceptional leadership raised standards and provided examples for aspiring commanders. The integration of administrative and military command in conquered territories created efficient governance. Military governors understood both security requirements and civil administration, preventing the disconnect that sometimes occurred in systems where military and civil authority operated separately. This integration enhanced overall effectiveness of Mongol rule. The succession planning within command structures ensured continuity when leaders fell in battle or died. Deputy commanders understood their superiors' plans and could assume command seamlessly. This depth in leadership prevented single casualties from paralyzing units or compromising operations. The Mongol military understood that victories could be achieved before battles through psychological operations that undermined enemy will to resist. Their sophisticated use of psychological warfare, reputation management and terror tactics complemented physical military capabilities. The cultivation of fearsome reputation began early and was deliberately maintained. Stories of Mongol invincibility, accounts of cities destroyed, descriptions of military prowess, all spread through merchants, refugees, and surviving opponents. By the time Mongol armies approached new territories, populations often already feared them, reducing will to resist. The systematic use of terror against cities that resisted served both immediate and long-term psychological purposes. When cities fell after resisting, the consequences were harsh and deliberately publicized. Survivors and refugees spread accounts of what happened, encouraging other cities to surrender rather than face similar outcomes. This strategic use of terror reduced overall violence by convincing many potential opponents to submit without fighting. The practice of offering generous terms to cities that surrendered quickly created clear incentives. Populations, knowing they could survive through submission, but face destruction through resistance, made rational calculations that often favoured surrender. This carrot-and-stick approach achieved objectives with minimal military effort in many cases. The exaggeration of army sizes formed part of psychological operations. Agents spread reports of massive forces, sometimes claiming armies much larger than reality. These exaggerations, combined with the Mongols' reputation, convinced opponents they faced overwhelming odds, sapping will to resist even before armies arrived. The use of captured prisoners to spread terror served psychological purposes. Refugees fleeing before Mongol advances carried accounts of what they'd witnessed, spreading fear into territories not yet invaded. This weapon of psychological warfare softened future resistance by creating anticipation of inevitable defeat. The practice of leaving some survivors from defeated armies deliberately created messengers who would spread accounts of Mongol military prowess. These survivors, returning to their homes, described the efficiency, discipline, and power of Mongol forces, contributing to the growing reputation that preceded Mongol advances. The display of military power without immediate attack created psychological pressure. Armies might appear near cities, demonstrate their capabilities through exercises or small-scale attacks, then offer terms. Populations watching massed cavalry formations, seeing siege engines, hearing the discipline and coordination of forces, often concluded that resistance would be futile. The exploitation of enemy divisions and encouragement of defections undermined resistance from within. Mongol offers of favourable treatment to factions that cooperated created temptations for pragmatic opponents to change sides. These defections, when publicised, further demoralised those still resisting. The creation of mythical status for exceptional Mongol commanders enhanced psychological impact. Generals like Subutai became legendary figures whose mere presence on battlefields affected enemy morale. The knowledge that exceptional commanders led opposing forces discouraged resistance even before tactical engagements began. The use of religious and cultural symbols to psychological advantage showed sophistication. The Mongols sometimes presented themselves as divine punishment for enemy sins or as agents of heaven's will. These religious framings, adapted to different cultures, placed resistance in context that discouraged it by suggesting it was futile to resist heaven's mandate. The speed and efficiency of Mongol conquest created cascading psychological effects. As more territories fell, remaining opponents faced growing certainty that resistance would fail. This momentum effect, where each victory made subsequent victories easier, characterized many phases of Mongol expansion. The contrast between the fate of those who surrendered and those who resisted created powerful demonstration effects. Cities standing near destroyed strongholds could see clearly what each choice entailed. This immediate visceral comparison made submission seem rational and resistance suicidal. The integration of captured specialists who confirmed Mongol power added credibility to psychological operations. When captured scholars, merchants, or officials who had personally experienced Mongol military capabilities described what they'd witnessed, their accounts carried more weight than propaganda from unknown sources. The use of diplomatic missions to assess enemy morale and spread psychological pressure served dual purposes. Ambassadors observed enemy preparations, leadership quality, and popular sentiment while simultaneously delivering messages designed to discourage resistance. These missions laid psychological groundwork before military action commenced. The maintenance of psychological pressure through sustained campaigns prevented enemy morale from recovering. Rather than allowing opponents breathing room between engagements, Mongol forces maintained continuous pressure through raids, skirmishes, and positioning that kept enemies in constant state of alert and anxiety. The creation of uncertainty about Mongol intentions kept enemies off balance. Would the Mongols attack immediately or conduct extended siege? Would they offer terms or launch direct assault? This uncertainty prevented effective planning and contributed to psychological pressure that sometimes caused defensive collapses without major military action. As the Mongol Empire expanded, its military increasingly incorporated warriors from conquered peoples, creating a diverse military force that combined capabilities from multiple martial traditions. This integration represented both challenge and opportunity, ultimately enhancing overall military effectiveness. The initial incorporation of Turkic peoples from Central Asia brought warriors with similar nomadic backgrounds into Mongol forces. These additions, culturally similar to the Mongols themselves, integrated relatively easily. They provided additional cavalry capabilities while expanding the available warrior pool beyond ethnic Mongols alone. The recruitment of Chinese engineers and specialists filled critical capability gaps in siege warfare and technical operations. These experts brought sophisticated knowledge of fortification, siege engines, explosives, and metallurgy. Their integration into the Mongol military transformed it from a primarily cavalry force into one capable of complex siege operations. The incorporation of Persian administrators and scholars enhanced military logistics and planning capabilities. Persian expertise in record-keeping, cartography, and organisation improved the Mongol military's administrative efficiency. This administrative sophistication supported larger, more complex operations than would have been possible relying solely on nomadic organisational methods. The use of Russian, Georgian, and Armenian troops provided infantry capabilities and regional knowledge. These forces, while serving under Mongol command, brought different tactical traditions and equipment that complemented nomadic cavalry tactics. The diversity of force composition allowed flexible responses to varied military challenges. The integration of naval capabilities through Chinese and Korean expertise enabled overseas operations previously beyond Mongol capabilities. Ship construction, navigation, and amphibious warfare techniques from maritime cultures expanded the military's operational environment. Though naval operations remained the least developed aspect of Mongol military power, the creation of multi-ethnic units required effective integration of different languages, customs, and traditions. The Mongols achieved this through several mechanisms: Mongol officers providing command continuity, standardized tactical training, religious tolerance, and focus on military effectiveness rather than cultural uniformity. These practices created cohesive forces despite diverse origins. The establishment of clear command structures with Mongol officers overseeing integrated units maintained control while utilizing diverse capabilities. This hierarchical approach prevented fragmentation along ethnic lines while leveraging the specific strengths different groups brought to combined forces. The merit-based advancement opportunities extended to capable warriors, regardless of ethnic origin, created incentives for excellence across all military components. A Chinese engineer who excelled might rise to supervise siege operations empire-wide. A Persian administrator could achieve high rank managing military logistics. This meritocracy encouraged contribution from all backgrounds. The rotation of mixed units between different theatres of operation prevented any single ethnic group from concentrating geographically and potentially developing separatist tendencies. A unit might campaign in China one year and Persia the next, with different ethnic components rotating through various regions under continuing Mongol command supervision. The standardization of equipment where possible created interoperability across diverse forces. While different types of troops maintained their specialized equipment, common elements like arrow types, signal systems, and basic gear created sufficient uniformity for coordinated operations. The preservation of specialized capabilities from different martial traditions enriched overall Mongol military practice. Heavy cavalry techniques from Persian and Khwarezmian traditions, infantry tactics from Chinese armies, siege techniques from various civilizations, all were studied, adapted, and incorporated into growing military knowledge. The language of command, primarily Mongolian supplemented by translators, provided communication across diverse forces. Critical commands, tactics, and procedures were taught in common language, ensuring that orders could be understood and executed regardless of troops' ethnic backgrounds. The shared experience of successful campaigns created bonds that transcended ethnic origins. Units that fought together successfully developed cohesion based on shared achievement and mutual reliance. These bonds, forged in campaign conditions, often proved stronger than ethnic identities in maintaining unit integrity. The distribution of rewards and spoils according to contribution rather than ethnicity maintained morale across diverse forces. Warriors saw that success led to material benefits regardless of background, creating incentives for all to contribute maximally to military operations. The establishment of clear regulations against inter-ethnic conflict within the military prevented internal divisions from undermining effectiveness. The Yasa Code specified harsh consequences for violence between military components, ensuring that diversity didn't lead to fragmentation. The gradual emergence of a military culture that transcended individual ethnic identities created a unifying force. This emerging culture, emphasizing martial excellence, loyalty to command structures, and pride in military achievements, gradually overshadowed ethnic distinctions for many warriors who spent years in service. The integration challenges that did occur were addressed pragmatically. When certain ethnic groups proved unsuited to particular roles, they were assigned to functions matching their capabilities. When cultural conflicts arose, they were managed through separation or mediation rather than allowed to fester. The long-term result was a military force more capable than any single ethnic group could have provided. The Mongol genius lay not just in conquest, but in the synthesis of diverse capabilities into coherent, effective military power that drew strength from its very diversity. The Mongol military's effectiveness across dramatically different environments, from Siberian forests to Arabian deserts, from Central Asian steppes to Chinese rice paddies, demonstrated remarkable adaptability. This capacity to operate effectively in diverse conditions was essential to their sustained success across a vast empire. The grassland steppes of Central Asia, the Mongol homeland, represented their natural environment. Here cavalry tactics reached full effectiveness with unrestricted mobility, clear lines of sight, and familiar terrain. The tactics and training developed on the steppes formed the foundation from which adaptations for other environments emerged. Forested terrain initially challenged Mongol cavalry tactics. The trees limited mobility and lines of sight while providing cover for defenders. The Mongols adapted by developing forest warfare tactics that emphasized dismounted operations, increased use of infantry elements, and coordination with local guides who understood the terrain. These adaptations allowed effective operations even in environments that negated traditional cavalry advantages. Mountainous regions required different approaches than open terrain. Narrow valleys and mountain passes channeled movements and limited the usual Mongol advantages in maneuver warfare. The adaptation involved careful reconnaissance, control of mountain passes, and willingness to conduct operations on foot when necessary. Local mountain peoples were sometimes recruited to provide specialized knowledge and capabilities. Desert warfare, particularly in the Middle East and Central Asia, required careful attention to water management and heat. The Mongols adapted by timing operations for cooler seasons when possible, using camels for transport in arid regions, and leveraging their experience from semi-arid Mongolian regions. The knowledge of water sources and oasis locations became critical to operational planning. Urban terrain, with its narrow streets and close quarters, differed dramatically from open battlefield environments. The Mongols adapted by developing street fighting tactics, using fire to clear defended areas, and coordinating cavalry with dismounted forces capable of close-quarters combat. The integration of siege warfare capabilities complemented these urban warfare adaptations. River crossings and wetland operations initially posed challenges for horse-based armies. The Mongols overcame these through multiple approaches, locating and using existing fords and bridges, building temporary bridges using local materials, and sometimes using boats or rafts constructed or captured locally. These solutions maintained operational mobility despite water obstacles. The rice paddy environments of southern China required substantial tactical adaptations. The flooded fields limited cavalry operations severely. The response involved increased reliance on infantry forces, often recruited locally, use of boats for mobility in flooded areas, and timing of operations for dry seasons when possible. These adaptations allowed successful campaigns even in terrain fundamentally unsuited to traditional Mongol warfare. Coastal and riverine environments required naval capabilities the Mongols initially lacked entirely. They addressed this through recruiting and integrating maritime specialists from Chinese, Korean, and other coastal peoples. While never achieving the naval sophistication of dedicated maritime powers, they developed sufficient capabilities to support coastal operations. Climate adaptation allowed operations across temperature extremes from Siberian winters to subtropical summers. Mongol warriors' nomadic background provided inherent hardiness, and their equipment adapted to conditions. Felt clothing layered for winter, lighter gear for summer, and experience with extreme conditions allowed sustained operations across climate zones. The seasonal timing of campaigns reflected understanding of how climate affected operations. Summer campaigns when horses were strongest and grass abundant. Autumn campaigns before winter made travel difficult. and avoidance of extreme weather when possible all showed sophistication in aligning military activities with environmental conditions. The management of horse welfare across different environments proved crucial. Grazing opportunities varied dramatically between steppes, forests, deserts, and agricultural regions. The Mongols adapted by varying the number of horses per warrior based on local grazing availability, supplementing forage with captured grain when necessary, and adjusting operational tempo to match horse condition. Altitude adaptations allowed operations in high mountain regions of Central Asia and Tibet. The Mongols' experience with elevated Mongolian plateau regions provided some preparation, but operations at extreme altitudes required additional adjustments in activity levels, recognition of altitude effects, and sometimes use of local guides and troops accustomed to high elevations. Weather exploitation became part of tactical planning. Attacks launched during storms that masked approach sounds, winter campaigns against enemies unused to cold, use of monsoon seasons that disrupted enemy logistics while Mongols adapted, all showed willingness to operate in conditions that immobilized opponents. The integration of local geographic knowledge through guides, captured personnel, and recruited local forces provided essential information for operations in unfamiliar terrain. This willingness to learn from locals rather than rigidly applying steppe warfare principles to unsuitable environments demonstrated pragmatic flexibility. Equipment modifications for different environments showed attention to practical details. Lighter armour in hot climates, additional winter gear for cold regions, different horse tack for varied terrain, all represented adjustments that maintained effectiveness across varied conditions. The establishment of regional military bases in different environments allowed forces to acclimatise and adapt more permanently. Forces stationed in Persia developed specific capabilities for Middle Eastern operations, while those in China specialised in East Asian conditions. This regional specialisation complemented the overall military system's unity. The Mongol military's innovations, tactics, and organisational principles influenced warfare long after the empire's decline. Understanding this legacy illuminates both the Mongols' immediate impact and their long-term significance in military history. The meritocratic promotion principle, revolutionary in its time, influenced later military organisations that recognised talent over birth as the basis for advancement. While many societies continued hereditary military leadership, the Mongol example demonstrated that merit-based systems could produce superior results. The decimal organisation system, elegant in its simplicity and scalability, influenced military organisational thinking across Eurasia. Various successor states and influenced regions adopted similar organisational principles, recognising their efficiency in command and control. The integration of intelligence gathering as systematic military practice, rather than ad hoc activity, represented significant advancement. Later military traditions increasingly recognised the value of systematic information collection and analysis, building on principles the Mongols demonstrated effectively. The combined arms integration, blending light cavalry, heavy cavalry, siege weapons, and infantry in coordinated operations, showed what could be achieved through tactical diversity. This principle influenced military thinking that moved away from reliance on single troop types toward balanced, flexible forces. The emphasis on mobility and manoeuvre over static defence influenced strategic thinking, particularly in Asian military traditions. The demonstration that highly mobile forces could defeat larger static armies encouraged doctrines emphasising manoeuvre and speed over positional warfare. The logistics innovations, particularly the ability to sustain large forces across vast distances with minimal supply lines, showed what could be achieved through systematic planning and flexibility. These lessons influenced later campaigns that required similar logistical sophistication. The psychological warfare techniques, including reputation management and strategic use of terror, demonstrated that battles could be won before fighting through undermining enemy will to resist. While morally problematic, these techniques influenced later understanding of warfare's psychological dimensions. The communication systems developed for military coordination across vast distances represented organisational sophistication that influenced later military and administrative practices. The relay networks and signal systems showed the importance of rapid, reliable communication. The adaptation of technologies from conquered peoples demonstrated the value of openness to innovation regardless of source. This principle, that military effectiveness matters more than cultural purity, influenced later military organizations that recognized the value of adopting superior enemy techniques. The training emphasis, particularly the integration of hunting with military preparation, showed how skills could be maintained through regular practice in peacetime activities. This principle influenced later military training that sought to keep forces ready through continuous activity. The religious tolerance within military structures, while not universal across the empire, demonstrated that diverse forces could function cohesively without religious uniformity. This practical pluralism influenced later multi-ethnic military organizations. The strategic vision operating at continental scales, planning campaigns years in advance across thousands of miles, represented military thinking unprecedented for its time. This strategic sophistication influenced later military thought about operational planning at grand scales. The naval adaptations, while representing Mongol military's weakest aspect, showed that even fundamentally land-based forces could develop maritime capabilities when strategic objectives demanded. This adaptability principle influenced later military organizations facing unfamiliar operational environments. The siege warfare evolution, from initial weakness to sophisticated capability within decades, demonstrated organizational learning capacity, the ability to identify deficiencies and systematically address them through recruitment, study and innovation, provided models for military development. The integration of diverse ethnic groups into effective unified forces showed what could be achieved through merit-based systems, practical tolerance, and focus on military effectiveness over ethnic purity. This model influenced later multi-ethnic military organizations, the command philosophy balancing central strategic direction with decentralized tactical execution demonstrated trust in subordinate commanders while maintaining overall coordination. This balance influenced later military organizational theory about appropriate levels of centralization. The preservation of institutional knowledge through both oral traditions and increasingly written records allowed lessons learned to be retained and transmitted. This knowledge management approach influenced later military organizations that recognized the value of capturing and sharing experience. The diplomatic military integration, using diplomacy to support military objectives and military power to support diplomatic aims, showed sophisticated understanding of how different instruments of power could support each other. This integration influenced later strategic thinking. The long-term impact on trade, cultural exchange and political organization across Eurasia, while beyond purely military considerations, reflected how military power could reshape entire civilizations. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative peace under Mongol rule, facilitated exchanges that influenced subsequent historical development. Standing at the end of this exploration of Mongol military capabilities, certain patterns emerge that help explain their remarkable success. The Mongol military represented not single innovation, but rather synthesis of multiple advantages working together to create unprecedented effectiveness. The foundation in nomadic culture provided natural advantages in mobility, horsemanship, archery and hardiness that agricultural societies couldn't easily match. These inherent capabilities, developed through daily life rather than specialized training, gave Mongol warriors baseline competence that others achieved only through extensive preparation. The organizational genius of Genghis Khan and his successors transformed scattered tribal capabilities into coordinated military power. The decimal system, merit-based promotion, systematic training, and sophisticated logistics created infrastructure that maximized the effectiveness of individual warriors and small units. The emphasis on intelligence gathering and careful planning meant that Mongol forces usually entered campaigns well informed about opponents, terrain, and conditions. This knowledge advantage, combined with tactical flexibility, allowed them to exploit enemy weaknesses while minimizing their own vulnerabilities. The psychological sophistication, understanding that wars could be won through undermining enemy will rather than just defeating enemy forces, multiplied the impact of military victories. Each success made subsequent campaigns easier by reinforcing the reputation that encouraged submission and discouraged resistance. The adaptability across varied opponents, terrain, and challenges showed learning capacity rare in military organizations. Rather than rigidly applying single doctrine regardless of circumstances, the Mongols adapted tactics and capabilities to specific situations, maintaining effectiveness across diverse operational environments. The integration of conquered peoples' capabilities created military forces more powerful than any single ethnic group could provide. This synthesis of diverse martial traditions, while presenting integration challenges, ultimately produced forces capable of operations impossible for culturally homogeneous armies. The command structure balancing strategic coherence with tactical flexibility gave commanders tools to respond to battlefield developments without losing overall coordination. This balance prevented both the chaos of complete decentralization and the rigidity of excessive centralization. The logistics enabling sustained operations far from homelands represented organizational sophistication that supported strategic objectives. The ability to campaign effectively in distant lands for extended periods allowed conquest and consolidation of territories that shorter duration operations couldn't achieve. The combination of mobility with firepower through mounted archery created tactical advantages difficult for opponents to counter. This combination allowed Mongol forces to deliver effective fire while maintaining mobility that prevented enemy retaliation, fundamentally advantaging Mongol tactics. The discipline and unit cohesion created through training, shared experience, and clear expectations made Mongol forces reliable executors of complex tactical plans. This reliability, combined with sophisticated tactics, allowed operations requiring precise timing and coordination. The long-term sustainability of the military system showed institutional strength beyond any single leader. While Genghis Khan created the foundation, the system survived him and his immediate successors, continuing to function effectively for decades after the empire's founding generation passed. The material and cultural legacy extended far beyond military history. The Mongol Empire's impact on trade, cultural exchange, technology transfer, and political organization shaped Eurasian development in ways that influenced subsequent centuries. The military power that built the empire enabled transformations whose effects long outlasted Mongol political control. The moral complexities of Mongol military success deserve recognition. While their military effectiveness was undeniable, it came at tremendous cost to conquered populations. The sophistication and success shouldn't obscure the suffering caused by campaigns that emphasized terror and sometimes involved massive loss of life. The historical contingency of Mongol success merits consideration. While their military system was formidable, they also benefited from fractured opponents, fortunate timing, and circumstances that might have been different in other eras. Understanding the Mongol military requires recognizing both their genuine innovations and the favourable context in which they operated. The lessons for understanding human conflict extend beyond military technicalities to questions about organisation, leadership, innovation, and adaptation. The Mongol experience shows how effective military forces emerge from combinations of cultural factors, organisational principles, technological capabilities, and strategic vision working together. As this journey through Mongol military capabilities reaches its conclusion, the remarkable nature of their achievements becomes clear. From scattered nomadic tribes on the Central Asian steppes emerged a military force that conquered territories from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, from Siberian forests to the Indian subcontinent's northern edges. The Mongol military succeeded through sophisticated combination of inherent advantages from nomadic culture, brilliant organisational innovations, tactical flexibility, strategic sophistication, and practical adaptability. They weren't simply fierce warriors overwhelming opponents through numbers or savagery, contrary to some simplistic portrayals. They were skilled professionals executing well-planned operations with impressive discipline and coordination. Their legacy extends beyond the medieval period into modern understanding of military effectiveness. The principles they demonstrated, merit-based promotion, systematic intelligence gathering, psychological operations, combined arms tactics, flexible command structures, remain relevant to military thinking today. While technologies have transformed warfare beyond recognition, underlying organisational and tactical principles show remarkable continuity. The Mongol Empire's eventual decline and fragmentation reflected challenges even the most capable military force faced in maintaining control over territories so vast and diverse. The same rapid conquests that built the empire created governance challenges that proved ultimately insurmountable. Succession disputes, regional fragmentation, and the enormous difficulty of administering lands stretching across half of Eurasia led to division and eventual dissolution. Yet the military innovations, organisational principles and tactical sophistications developed during the empire's height influenced successor states and regional powers for centuries. The military traditions of Central Asian peoples, the organisational approaches of various successor khanates, and the strategic thinking across Eurasian civilizations all bore marks of Mongol influence long after the unified empire ceased to exist. Modern scholarship continues to deepen understanding of Mongol military capabilities, drawing on archaeological discoveries, careful analysis of diverse historical sources, and comparative studies across military traditions. Each generation of historians adds nuance and detail, moving beyond both romanticised portrayals and simplistic condemnations toward more complete, balanced understanding. The Mongol military story ultimately illustrates human capacity for organisation, innovation, and achievement in pursuit of objectives, however we might evaluate those objectives today. It shows how cultural practices, organisational genius, tactical innovation, and strategic vision can combine to create historical forces that reshape their worlds. For students of military history, the Mongol military provides endlessly fascinating case studies in effectiveness, adaptation, and organisation. For those interested in leadership and management, the command structures and merit-based systems offer insights applicable beyond military contexts. For anyone curious about how human societies organise and deploy force, the Mongol example remains compelling despite the centuries since their campaigns. The stone remnants of Mongol campaigns, fortifications, and settlements still dot landscapes from China to Hungary. These physical traces, supplemented by historical records from multiple civilizations affected by Mongol expansion, preserve memory of a military force whose impact shaped medieval history and whose innovations influenced subsequent military development. Thank you for joining this exploration of how the Mongol military achieved its remarkable successes. May the insights gained illuminate both medieval history and timeless questions about military effectiveness, organisational excellence, and the capacity of human societies to achieve extraordinary things through systematic application of knowledge, discipline, and innovation. Until next time, rest well.